That is the reason sometimes I regret working in Tata Memorial Hospital because we tend to get to see this too often for my liking. Okay, so I'm going to cover three talks, three emergencies. There are many of those, but first I'm going to talk about tumor lysis syndrome. The second is superior vena cava syndrome, and the third is HLH. So tumor lysis syndrome can occur spontaneously. Sometimes the patient's presentation is with a tumor lysis syndrome, arrhythmias, and sometimes they even go into arrest. And this is the reason why our technicians are kept on their toes because we need to dialyze this patient quite frequently during the off-duty hours. So this will occur in patients who are unfortunately or fortunately treatment responsive. Okay, so you can have bulky tumors which can cause tumor lysis syndrome in a hurry without being given any treatment, or you can have tumor lysis syndrome in patients who were just given single cycle of chemotherapy. Fortunately, our medical oncologists are quite aggressive about chemotherapy and therefore they keep monitoring these patients very, very aggressively. So, commonly seen in Burkitt's lymphoma spontaneously most often. You can also see it rarely in hepatoblastomas and neuroblastomas, but that I have not seen very often. So, leukemias and Burkitt's lymphoma are very common, but it can occur in any patient with malignancy. So, once the tumor cells lies, you will get the leakage of ions and the leakage of the DNA degradation products into the circulation. And obviously, the primary means of their disposal is renal. So, the first system to take hit is the genitourinary system, and these patients will often land in AKI, particularly if they are not treated early. So you get a host of metabolic derangements. So you will get hyperkalemia and hyperphosphatemia, and you will get hyperuricemia. And uric acid is not very soluble. So you can have renal dysfunction because of that, and all of these factors can lead to acute renal failure in this patient. So if you look at the nucleic acid metabolism, you will get adenosine hypoxanthine, and this hypoxanthine gets converted into xanthine and subsequently into uric acid by xanthine oxidase. So either you block the formation of xanthine, which is again not water soluble and therefore not excreted, or you convert the already formed uric acid into allantoin, which is extremely water soluble, and this leads to renal excretion if the patient is treated appropriately early in the course of the disease. At the same time, you will get hyperkalemia and release of phosphates because of the cell lysis. And the third arm is a release of cytokines, which will lead to inflammation, hypotension, and that itself will cause acute kidney injury. And if the patient has already chronic renal disease or has developed AKI plus the TLS is left untreated, that acute kidney injury is further progresses. So there are many risk factors, but essentially, if the patients are not hydrated well before starting chemotherapy, or if the patients become oliguric or hypotensive, you will get acute renal failure. And if before treatment you do LDH level and if they are high, then they indicate a high tumor volume, and it is also a strong prognostic indicator for development of complications. So the acute kidney injury that occurs in tumor lysis syndrome is multifactorial. Uric acid itself can cause vasoconstriction and it is pro-inflammatory, so it leads to release of cytokines. Then you have crystal related tissue injury in the kidney. So calcium phosphate crystals can be deposited, uric acid crystals and xanthine. They all precipitate in the renal tubules and obstruct physically as well as cause inflammation, which further leads to acute kidney injury. If both are present, uric acid and calcium phosphate are both are present, then they help each other precipitate in the kidney and worsen the thing. Low solubility we'll see in a minute. And if the patient with AKI additionally has tumor lysis syndrome, it's a strong predictor of death and mortality is quite high. So it's a disease which can be treated very easily if you have a high index of suspicion and you treat them early. So that is generally not a problem if you are working in a cancer hospital, because the medical oncologist and the ICU team, they are both very aware of this, that this is the first thing that can occur. But if you are occasionally going to see a hemato-oncology patient in your ICU, then you need to have a high index of suspicion. So this is something that you must keep in the back of your mind. So two things I always tell my boys in the ICU. Hypercalcemia is very common in patients. So patient who comes with some sort of mental obtundation, the first thing you do is a blood gas and look at the calcium and correct the calcium and see whether it is high or not. And the second thing is hyperkalemia and hyperphosphatemia. Now phosphates we generally don't tend to measure, so therefore you need to be even more aware. Unless you are used to monitoring phosphates daily, which we do because we work in the setup that we do. But that is something also that you need to keep in mind. Okay, so this solubility of metabolites is important because we'll talk about the treatment later on. So you can see that allantoin is soluble at whatever pH. So if you can convert already formed uric acid into allantoin, then the patient is very unlikely to get acute renal failure. Hypoxanthine is also quite soluble. The solubility of uric acid increases as the pH increases. So acidic pH, it will stay in the body, stay in the circulation and get deposited in the renal tubules. Calcium phosphate is very soluble at lower pH and becomes insoluble at higher pH, and therefore hydration is very important, and that is generally true. In hypercalcemia we tend to give hydration because that is the mainstay of treatment for hypercalcemia, and xanthine is not soluble whatever you do. The other effects it will produce is cardiac dysrhythmias, and it will cause neuromuscular irritability which can lead to tetany or seizures. So the Cairo Bishop definition of laboratory TLS for adults, I am sure all of you are aware of this, that you look at the uric acid, potassium, phosphorus and calcium levels, and even if the values are not high, if there is a sudden increase by greater than 25% from the baseline levels, then you will diagnose TLS. Now very often in other hospitals which are general hospitals, you may not have baseline values of phosphate or uric acid. Calcium and potassium you almost always have. So in our hospital, fortunately, they will, before giving chemotherapy, they will do all the baseline values, so that if there is a change in the value, they will immediately note this. Then there is a grading of clinical TLS for adults, and this is not often given in the textbooks. Okay, so you are free to copy this presentation if you want. So it ranges from 0 to grade 5. Grade 5 is dead. Therefore, creatinine value is not given for grade 5. Cardiac arrhythmias, again grade 5, patient is dead, so no No grading for cardiac arrhythmias or seizures, either for grade 5. And in between the arrhythmias which may be significant, non-significant, etc., number of seizures, whether the consciousness is altered, etc., again, or a difficult to control seizure in grade 4, and so on and so forth. So, like I said, most important thing is to anticipate the development of tumor lysis syndrome, and the key determinant of outcomes is fluid management. So, what we aim to do is maintain the renal function, prevent dysarrhythmia. So, automatically, if you maintain the renal function and make sure that the hyper enhanced values of calcium and potassium, phosphate and potassium are corrected, will not get dysarrhythmias and neuromuscular irritability. The goal is to get at least 2 ml per kg per hour. So sometimes these patients will look bloated because they are often given lots of fluid, maybe 100 to 200 ml per hour, and if the hydration does not improve the urine output, then a loop diuretic can be used. So, if you want to correct hyperuricemia, you have three options apart from hydration: allopurinol, which is slower acting, and it has hypersensitivity reactions as well as drug interaction. Febuxostat has recently become available. We are starting to see this use of febuxostat preemptively in our patients now, which are coming to us from ward. And rasburicase breaks down the uric acid directly, and it's very costly. But so the recommended dose treatment is at least for 3 days, but sometimes a single dose will prevent all the complications. So it's costly, but it is cost effective in the sense that it will bring down the uric acid levels immediately, and you might need only a single dose. So the cost that is often quoted to be an issue, single dose will cost something between 25 to 30,000 till the Indian manufacturers come out of with it, and then you might get it at a cheaper rate, but there will be no drug in the vial. So you are better off treating with the original molecule, right? So there was a study which compared rasburicase and allopurinol, and they obviously found that the incidence of TLS was much lower in patients who were given rasburicase, and also fewer patients required dialysis in patients who got rasburicase. So rasburicase seems to be the way to go, particularly if the patient is high risk or you think that the patient has got high tumor load. Patients who develop spontaneous tumor lysis, in those cases you should give rasburicase. So I showed you the chart about urinary pH and the solubility of various products of uric acid. The problem comes when the patient develops hyperphosphatemia. So previously they used to call that cocktail kind of thing. So the patients would get allopurinol and they will get syrup-cetal, and the nurses used to dip their dipstick in the urine for checking the urinary pH. So now it's not recommended. We should not do any alkalinization of urine, because we are not sure whether this prevents AKI, and the annual evidence suggests that it does not benefit the patient. So alkalinization is no longer recommended. I am not going to talk too much about hyperkalemia treatment or hyperphosphatemia treatment. Very often you will end up giving them 2 or 3 bursts of sessions of renal replacement therapy. They will often be hemodynamically stable. So IST for 1 or 2 days, most of the times will suffice. The important thing is that if you diagnose TLS, you should treat these patients either in HDU or IDU, ICU, where you can monitor the electrocardiography, so that if there are arrhythmias, you can treat them immediately. And frequent lab reports is, in my hospital, if you send a report from the ward, there is no guarantee when you will get the report back. But if you send it from the ICU, then it comes back fairly quickly. So we tend to treat these patients in ICU because so that we can monitor them more easily. If you do not get the biochemistry back immediately, you can at least do blood gases and check for potassium. So that is the reason we tend to treat them in intensive care unit. Superior vena cava syndrome. How many people have seen superior vena cava syndrome? Okay. So it was previously described mostly in patients with infections. So common infections were tuberculosis and any other infection that you can think of, which can lead to SPC syndrome. Syphilis. So very unusual, but syphilis was a common cause of SPC syndrome along with tuberculosis historically. So there is either partial or complete obstruction of the superior vena cava, and generally the patients will present like this. They will present with dyspnea. Sometimes the first presentation might be this. So they will come to the casualty, inability to lie down, badly distressed, and then they come to the ICU. And if you do not think of the SPC syndrome, then the registrar, who is often the junior person on the duty during the night, will try to intubate this patient. Now, in these patients, glottic visualization is not a problem. You will see the cords. The problem is because the trachea is compressed, you will not be able to get a normal size tube in. If you get a normal size tube in, you still might not be able to ventilate these patients because you may not be able to bypass the obstruction, which is an extrinsic obstruction, completely. So if you can reach beyond the obstruction and you have some part of trachea left before the carina where your tube position is or tube tip is, then the ventilation is normal. Otherwise, you are often ventilate only one lung because one side is compressed. So that is the problem with the airway in this patient. So SPC syndrome is an emergency mainly for airway reasons and of course for lack of venous damage, drainage from the brain, upper body, upper limbs and head and neck areas. Because these patients directly come to casualty, you will often not know the issue diagnosis. If it's a hematolymphoid malignancy, the immediate treatment is a steroid, but the medical oncologist will hate you for the entire life of the patient and your entire life if you give methylprednisolone or dexamethasone to these patients, because if you perform the biopsy subsequently, the differentiation of the tissue diagnosis is lost if you are given steroids. They need to do something called as immunohistochemistry. I am sure all of you are familiar with that, which allows them to accurately diagnose what type of tumor is present, because that they need to know for prognosticating the patient. So you will have a patient who is difficult to manage airway wise. Okay, you don't really want to put the patient on the ventilator, but the patient can't lie down, and you have to have tissue diagnosis, right? And you don't want to give steroids before the diagnosis or biopsy is obtained, right? So there are lots of etiologies. You can now see that because we are using more Hickmans, more Otacats and things like that, tunnel catheters, you will get higher incidence of SVC syndrome just because of the presence of the tunnel catheter in place, but that is still not a very common reason, at least in my ICU. So you will, chest X-ray is often non-specific because it will not tell you about the extent of compression. You will see a widened mediastinum. You might see some compression of the lungs, etc. But if you do a CT chest and neck, they are often enough. If you think it is because of thrombus, then you might need a venography or angiography of some kind. So, like I said earlier, it's a airway emergency. The compression of the tracheobronchial tree, which is causing airway compromise, is a main problem when they present to you, and you will need to intubate these patients with a small endotracheal tube. Right? So the trick is to know whether you can bypass the obstruction. If you can't bypass the obstruction, you will need to adjust your tidal volumes if you are going to ventilate only one lung, which often happens. These patients also might have a problem, particularly if one lung is blocked, main bronchus is blocked, because then there will be pooling of secretions and development of pneumonia already even before you start treating these patients. Now sometimes you can just bypass the obstruction and allow the patient to wake up, and then the patient is comfortable lying down because you have taken care of the obstruction. So you may or may not need ventilation depending on whether the patient has pneumonia or not. What do I mean by easier to give chemotherapy than radiotherapy is that particularly if the patient needs ventilation and his oxygenation status is bad, radiotherapy takes much longer to act. So you have to transport the patient to the cobalt unit or whatever form of radiotherapy you are giving, and doing it every day at a fixed time with ICU being busy, not busy, etc. might be a problem. So it's easier to give chemotherapy. Very often it turns out to be Hodgkin's or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and chemotherapy will just melt the tumor. I mean, that's what they always tell us. They dangle it actually like a carrot in front of us, that you just intubate this patient, I will give chemotherapy, and tomorrow the patient will walk home. It doesn't happen that quickly, but they always show that carrot to you. But yes, so if you give chemotherapy, so remember, large tumor chemotherapy, high chance of tumor lysis also. Okay, so in these patients also you can get tumor lysis syndrome. So you have to keep that in mind all the time. Okay, there is something called as Kishi's scoring system, which I was also not aware of, because it deals with SVC stenting. Okay, so the SVC is blocked. Then you use Kishi's scoring system to see whether the patient requires a stent. If the score is more than 4, it indicates a need for percutaneous stent placement. Right? It's free download. Just put in Kishi's scoring system, you will get the entire article, and you can read and read and read till you are sick of it. Okay? Because it is not going to be useful in your daily practice. The only part in that entire chart that I have put in red is that consider stenting for immediate symptom palliation. I have been working in TMH for last 26 years. I have not even seen it once. Okay, so it is an option. The stent placement is an option, but it is generally not required. Just chemotherapy is enough. If the patient is said that the surgeon or the medical oncologist says the palliation, then you give radiation, whatever. But generally, targeted therapy or chemotherapy works in these patients. Okay, coming to the last part. So this is quite rare. Okay, In last 10 years, I have seen this one case which we reported. We still don't know which virus caused this problem in this patient. Okay. But you should be aware of it. You might get an occasional patient without a malignancy in your ICU who might have HLH. Right? So, you will find that the macrophages have phagocytosed your leukocytes and either RBCs or the thrombocytes, and this is generally the diagnosis confirmation is generally done by bone marrow aspiration. Uh, I have once done a skin region biopsy where you are supposed to be able to demonstrate the phagocytosis, but in that patient it didn't turn out to be true. This is thought to occur because of overactivation of microphages. So you can often see this in patients with systemic infections, just systemic infection without malignancy. You can you can see this in patients with collagen vascular diseases. Fortunately, I don't treat those patients. And these T lymphocytes, which can have a congenital or acquired problem in their functioning, can lead to stimulated macrophages and production of cytokines, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and interleukin 1 and 6. So it is classified as primary or familial HLH, and what we come across generally is the acquired or secondary HLH in the ICU. So patient will present to you with fever, spikes, generally multi-organ dysfunction. At least 2 lines out of 3 lines will fail. So patient can have low hemoglobin or low platelets or low white cell count in absence of any plausible reason, and the patient will have coagulopathy. So for diagnosis you have to have 5 out of 8 diagnostic criteria of these. For adults, at least I know that the ferritin levels have to be more than 10,000 units per liter, and we don't do the increased soluble IL-2 receptor levels. So I am just going to run through this because there is no way I can read this, and certainly you can't read this. So viruses cause it, bacteria cause it, protozoas and fungi, and you can go through the list. The reference is there, it's available for free download, so you can read that. You can have many hematological malignancies which are associated with HLH. Again, because it is not very common, we need to have a high index of suspicion. Generally the rash, a scaly kind of rash is generally present. So if you have multi-organ failure with just rash, also think of HLH and get ferritin done, LDH done, which we don't routinely do, and ferritin we hardly do in the intensive care unit. Now these guidelines were prepared by HLH group and macrophage activation syndrome group. Okay, and I don't know what anakinra is, but I suppose it is a immunomodulator. So you can generally the therapy will go like this. If I get a patient of HLH, first thing I will do is call my girlfriend in the hemato-oncology department. She is very good at picking things in these patients, because apparently the incidence of HLH is much higher in ward than the patients coming to the ICU. So they see it more often. So very high is by definition 5 or 6 times a year, right? And one of them lands up in the ICU. So you really need to have high index of suspicion. The patients will often need multi-organ support. They will need a biopsy, either bone marrow aspiration, for which again you will need a hemato-oncology consult, and the hematologist to have a look at the slide, because it is peculiar, but depending on which hospital you work in, they will give you the diagnosis like that. So if I send CSF from my ICU, for example, I will often get a report saying no malignant cells seen, and they will not talk about any other thing that they might see there. So I am not interested in malignant cell. Patient has got meningitis, for God's sake, but that is the report that you will get. Or if I send a peripheral smear, no abnormal cells seen, but I am looking for malaria. They don't look at the malaria. So you need to talk to them and tell them what you want them to see. Methylprednisolone and dexamethasone. Generally, the medical oncologist will start with a steroid, then they will add etoposide, and then they will add methotrexate. I have not yet seen anybody using cyclosporine, but apparently it is quite commonly used. And the drug that's lower down there, which I can't pronounce, is supposed to work in refractory, recurrent, or progressive disease. And in the end, you can give IVIG. So to summarize, TLS is quite common and quite fatal, and you need to treat it aggressively. SVC syndrome is common, easy to diagnose but difficult to treat. HLE is rare but often has poor outcomes, and a vast range of microorganisms may be involved, and again it is difficult to treat, and often these patients will die. Thank you.